that hit, or possibly a political catastrophe of some sort, plague, if you will. So, and then the culture that built the Great Pyramid could have been destroyed, but so it's interesting though. So take anything an Egyptologist tells you, take it with a grain of salt, because it's all under debate.
Yeah. Well,
and nothing is settled.
I'll bet. And I bet there's quite a lot of PhD and postdoctoral scholars that don't agree with one another either at this point.
That's true. That's true. But a lot of Egyptologists, to become an Egyptologist, you sit in a classroom for X number of years in college and are told a bunch of stuff, and then you and then you agree with what you're told, and then you become an Egyptologist, and then those people do the same thing. They tell the new students the same stories, and then they get a degree. And, but nobody provides any demonstrations or anything else. Egyptology is sort of like a science that is stagnated, if you will, and they're not really progressing like other sciences have.
Yeah.
If you were in a classroom for Egyptologists, in the 1900s, like 1910, it would be virtually the same as now. So,
very interesting. Yeah. Well, we are going to get after the top of the hour here in our short break that we're going to get into your theories of how this whole Great Pyramid was constructed and what the purpose of this structure was for as well. I just want to let people know that we are going to get into the details big time when we come back from a break. But I just thought maybe I should ask you before we go there to the break. Is it your opinion that the Great Pyramid, the largest one there, is the first pyramid, was the first pyramid that was constructed, or is there some kind of a timeline that you know about on which was built first?
Well, Egyptologists say that the Great Pyramid was one of the earlier pyramids, even though it is one of the pyramid with the most precise construction, if you will. But then later pyramids were built much more primitively. But the sequence of construction of the pyramids in Egypt is, again, under scholarly debate. But if the Great Pyramid was built pre-catastrophe, if you will, then it would have been built before the others. They could have been copies similar to a cargo cult. I don't know if you're familiar with that. Okay. There could be like copies like that, a cargo cult copies. So, but the sequence of the construction of the Great Pyramid, of the pyramids in Egypt, is actually beyond the scope of my research.
Okay.
But, probably the Great Pyramid.
Okay, well, hang on a second, Stephen. We're going to go to a break. So just hang on, and we will be back in about 3 minutes.
you can advertise your business on Night Dreams Talk Radio, and you will be heard worldwide. Why not contact us at nightdreamstalkradio@gmail.com. Your Saturday Night Dreams Talk Radio Network. Your host, the Paranormal Lawyer.
Yes, and we are back. Gosh, that was a blazing first hour with Stephen Myers, and we are talking about the Great Pyramid of Giza. And now I'm excited to get into the details of how Stephen has researched on this great, massive structure that, for what he's saying, for 4,000 years was the largest and the tallest structure on the planet for 4,000 years. That is just amazing to think that anything could be at least that old and be that dramatic for that length of period of time. So, Stephen, thank you for holding on with us during the break there. Are you back?
Oh, yes, I'm here and ready to go.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much. This has really been an informative session so far here. I have not been able to talk with anyone like yourself who's got the inclination and the research behind this kind of a thing with the Great Pyramid. You know, we always see those History Channel and A&E productions of, how these pyramids were created and what they were used for. And I'm looking forward to getting your perspective on some of the more details here. So why don't you go ahead and just take the reins for a while. And I know you probably have a story that you like to tell in a certain order. You want to kind of get into the details now of this Great Pyramid for our listeners out there.
Okay, well, the Great Pyramid, the last remaining wonder of the ancient world, I think had a tremendous purpose. And instead of being a fancy gravestone for a dead guy or pointing to something to tell other people something symbolic, I think that the Great Pyramid was actually built with a purpose that helped people. It helped the people that built it. And they went to a huge expense to build the Great Pyramid, cost and labor and materials. But that cost was ultimately a wise investment, because the Great Pyramid, that big structure of stone, provided a huge, tangible return on investment. And that's something that people can understand, in the here and now, about a return on investment. If let's say you invest $100 and you get 150 back in a couple days, that's pretty good. But, that's a pretty good return on investment. But the Great Pyramid provided a return on investment. The Great Pyramid was infrastructure for the civilization that built it. It was a functioning machine when built. And that functioning machine provided prosperity for the civilization that built it. It transformed the desert into a garden, and it transformed poverty into prosperity, and it transformed empty bellies into full bellies, and it provided prosperity by being this infrastructure, and it did all of that by being a water pump. The Great Pyramid was built as a water pump, and that's I wrote an entire book about that. But my first book is about how the Great Pyramid was assembled. How did they move big, heavy stones from point A to point B? And that was my first book, and it's titled Lost Technologies of the Great Pyramid. And we think that the original builders were geniuses, and they were able to provide a water source to the building site where the Great Pyramid is now. And the first stones set in place were the casing stones, if you will, the first level of casing stones. And that created a square wall, a small. Imagine that's the only stones that were set in place was the first level of casing stones. Those stones are cemented together with a bonding agent that's stronger than the stone itself. And the few remaining casing stones that are still at the Great Pyramid are bonded together watertight to this day. We also think that, yes, it's a very fascinating aspect of this structure. And anyway, we also think that there were water locks like those in the Erie Canal or the Panama Canal, but not as big as the Panama Canal by any means. And water locks from the Nile River all the way up to the building site. And that square enclosure of casing stones was filled with water. And water from there, and the water locks went all the way up to that pond, if you will, the pond on the Great Pyramid. And then a systematic procession of stones on barges from the Nile River went up those water locks all the way up to the building site and into that pond. And then they moved the stones, the interior stones, off of the barge and into the pond. And when that pond was filled, the first level of the Great Pyramid was completed. And they continued that process with adding the next layer of casing stones and added additional water, which rose the level of the pond up to the second layer, and stones on barges, like, a production line of stones on barges came up the water locks and filled in that pond, that second layer of pond, with stones. And when that pond again was filled with stones, the second layer was completed. And they continued that process, and each level had a pond, and they had a corresponding water lock up the side of the Great Pyramid, so the stones could move all the way up into the building site and up to their final location. So that's the systematic process of moving stones to construct the Great Pyramid.
Okay. Well,
in a nutshell.
In your book, by the way, Lost Technologies of the Great Pyramid, are there any kind of renderings, graphics, or anything that kind of explain how that works in your book?
Yes, there's quite a few. Yeah, it helps. It's very visual. This construction process, certainly different than an idea of knuckle draggers dragging stones, if you will, that Egyptologists have made up. The ramp would have been bigger than the Great Pyramid itself, so
right.
It's just not feasible in the real world, only in books written by Egyptologists. But yes, my books have a lot of illustrations, and I have also produced 2 documentaries that are available from Amazon.com. The first one is about how the Great Pyramid was assembled, with a lot of computer-generated animations showing how the stones were moved on and off of barges and how they were set in place, and how the water locks operated, and the whole thing, very, very detailed. So there's a whole bunch of information that people can become familiar with about this construction process to construct the Great Pyramid.
Okay, so let's send people to, or at least give them the tools that they need to go to find